you let a drawing sit for a bit. Once you start it, you can always tell the stuff that has to be fixed because it gives you a whole new look on things. What the heck? I thought somebody was trying to get in my house. Always something. All right, we'll edit that out of the video. Now, looking at my drawing again, I'm going to assess it for irregularities and issues of inconsistency. So one of the ways that I do that, especially with portraits, is I'll flip my eyes back and forth between, I mean, it should do it from my drawing to the computer, but I can do it from the image on the computer to the image on the photo. So I think I made his nose a little too big. But if you flip your eyes back and forth, oh, here's a big problem here. I can see this right now. I got the jawline wrong. So flip it back and forth really quick between your eyes, between your source, whether it's your model or something that you're looking at in your drawing, and try to find where the discrepancies might be. So I see his ear needs to be a bit more angled. Oh my goodness, there's all kinds of problems with it. But that's okay, we're going to fix it. And his jawline is more angled. I think the mouth is okay. I think the eyebrows are a bit high. Now, granted, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I also think that the positioning of his eyes is off a little. That's probably one of the hardest things to get, is to get both eyes to look at the same place. So here's where you want to draw lightly and carefully when you first start out, so that when you do want to make changes, they're changeable. In addition, I am going to use my bridge, which is a handy acrylic thing that's getting pretty beat up, but because I don't want to smudge it, but I need to fix that eye. The eye, remember, the eye is a round, wet thing, mass of gelatinous goo that's sitting in a bowl of bone surrounded by muscle. So really keep that in mind when you're drawing eyes, to make sure that they stay round and spherical within their little nest. A lot of people will tend to draw the eyes as flat, but they're not, they're round. And his eyes are in shadow, but as I mentioned last time, there's still a little bit of lightness on the bottom corner of the iris there, because the irises, the corneas are clear and the light comes through the cornea and lights up the other side, which is pretty cool if you think about it. I like looking at cat's eyes from the side because they're such a big dome of clear. So I thought his nose was a little long, and I do still find that to be somewhat of the case. So I'll pull it up. I'm just going to pull it up a little bit. So on portraits, a good trick, and look for this, and if you don't see it, fake it, is the shadow and reflected light under the nose as it protrudes out from the face. Remember not to draw lines around things, but rather, if you're trying to do a realistic portrait anyway, you want to do it as an edge and not as a total line. You want to make it just as an edge there. The minute you put a line around something is the minute you take all the depth out of it, flatten it out, and it becomes just a cookie cutter. So you don't want a cookie cutter. You want to have a form. I love kids' mouths because they don't have all these creases and lines around them yet. And they've got these little soft folds, especially babies' mouths. Babies are just all folds and dimples. Now, he's not a baby, but I still get a kick out of. It's such a cruel thing that time does to us. Makes us all lined and wrinkled. Gravity is not nice. You can just barely catch a little bit of the shadow of the far side of the mouth over there. It's a little hard to see exactly what's going on. So understanding the anatomy when you can't quite see it, if you can keep in mind the underlying structure from all your anatomical studies, you can fake it or fill in the gaps in what you see with knowledge. Though you want to be careful about that too, because sometimes less is more. So that's a balancing act. You can't really see the eyelashes on this side of his head.
Yeah, that is frustrating that the guys got the great eyelashes and we're stuck putting mascara on ours, huh? Don't they have the
I
best
know.
eyelashes?
They do. It's so sad. I once saw this 90-year-old man who had these just beautiful, beautiful eyelashes, and they were black. Even though his hair was completely white, his eyelashes were totally black. It was so weird. It was cool though. I think I really did a number on his eyebrow there. I've got to do something about that. That's way too dark. Take it off. So
You,
I don't
you
want
know
to.
how you were talking about people with abnormalities and you're kind of drawn to them to figure out what it
What's
is
so
that,
weird? Yeah.
yeah, what's the weirdness? Because there's somebody in our complexes like that. But it just kind of reminded me of a joke about um I don't know if I can tell you this joke or
Well,
not.
you're being recorded, so be careful.
Okay, I won't tell it
So
then.
it is interesting though. I'm reading a book called Mutants, and it's
Mm.
all about genetic anomaly and how fragile the whole system is. One little tweak of something not quite lining up in the genetic code, and you get all kinds of crazy stuff. It's really interesting. So there is a shadow, a slight edge, not a line, but an edge on his forehead. He looks a little bit like Elvis Presley to me right now. I don't. So I'm going to focus on the highlights and shadows, especially when I'm having problems with a form of getting a likeness. Squint at the model and squint at your drawing and find those major shapes of shadows and make sure they line up, because that will help push things into their proper position. And then there's some reflected light, and then a darker shadow right under here, which will help define the bottom of the chin without actually drawing a line around it. We've got a little bit of shadow here. And the shadow, it's cool because if you follow around the shadows, you can also define the surface underneath based on how the shadow travels across the surface of whatever happens to be underneath. So like this goes here like this, with this little wingtip on the collar. And then we've got a shadow that curves around and then curves down. And then here's a little bit of drapery action going here. So then it crawls up around that curve and dips down and back up. And this is like an edge on. Yeah, I know the eyebrows all screwed up. Don't know what I'm gonna do. I hope I don't have to start it over. He's got dark eyebrows, but they're not that dark. I'm gonna see how it balances out with adding more shadow before I start worrying too much about it. In other words, you don't want to work in isolation on the overall. You want to try to work on it pretty evenly if you can overall, in order to keep it balanced and gestalt, so that one part isn't more focused or finished than another part. Like I got a little ear crazy last time, and I went a little far on the ear before I had developed enough of the rest of the figure here, because the ear is at quite the angle. And then ears are really interesting. You can have an attached earlobe or a detached earlobe, and it's all genetic, like the shapes of noses. And here again, the shadow kind of follows a contour as it runs over and around the surfaces underneath it. I'm a little more stressed about this particular drawing because it's my nephew, so if it was somebody I didn't know or didn't care about, I might not be quite as invested in the drawing. So there's always that as a complication to your creativity. So what is the focus? Who's the audience? So many things to consider. Yeah, if he was just some stranger, it would be like, so I got his eyes a little crooked, who cares? But it's my nephew, and God forbid my sister should see this video and see what a mess I'm making of her kid. That would be terrible. Okay, so this is a stylistic choice. I like to try to develop I did make his nose too big, doggone it. I like to try to develop the shadows and highlights without leaving too much of the actual mark of the pencil. I try to go for pure value. But another way would be to utilize that stroke to make it part of an integral part of the drawing. So 2 different ways of approaching, or 3, because I could go in with a smudge tool and make it really smooth and more like a pastel painting, and that would be a whole other way of approaching it. So, and you can definitely go any one way, but whatever you choose for it, you have to stick to it for the whole portrait. So if I were to start smudging it, I would have to commit to that, smudge the whole thing. Yeah, it's like a random flower too. It's like, oh, it's just a flower, no big deal. Nobody's going to know that that's not that particular flower with that particular bend and that one particular petal. But oh my goodness, if somebody has a particular slant to their eyebrow and you don't get it just right. We're hardwired to be tuned into faces. The first thing we see from birth is our mother's face. Although there is a condition, a neurological condition called face blindness, where a person cannot recognize faces. It's very odd, but it does exist. So they learn how to recognize people with other clues like the color of their hair or the tone of their voice or a particular scent. They cannot recognize people based just simply on a visual cue. It's really strange. It's not very common, 1 in 100 or a couple hundred or something like that. But it's certainly interesting. But we are most of us are really, really tuned into faces, and so we get really uptight when we draw faces and really wound up when faces don't look quite right. I think that's why it's hard when people have injuries or deformities, it's so hard to deal with because it makes something in our brain just tweak a little bit. Like, I don't know, I always put myself in the person's shoes and just think, oh God, what if, like that poor lady that had her face torn off by the chimpanzee and then she got a face transplant. Very interesting thing, but how horrifying. Okay.
I know I was walking down the street one time, Elmwood Avenue, when I was going to college up upstate, and some kids yelled out the window at me, "Hey, why don't you get a new forehead?" And I'm like, wow, yeah, why don't I?
Go to the store and pick up a new forehead. Sure, why not? And it's funny how, like, you can be put off by somebody's appearance at first, but once you get to know them, they suddenly start to look different. And sometimes people could be really beautiful when you first meet them, but then you find out that they really have a really lousy personality and they're not so attractive anymore. It's kind of interesting. Oh, I might have to do this over. I'm not happy with the way this is coming out. But that's okay. No drawing is wasted because every time you draw, you get one drawing closer to perfection.
But you don't have the hair in yet. If you get the
I
hair
know.
in,
You think that'll make a difference? Maybe.
Yeah, definitely.
Might. It just might. We'll have to give it a try and see what happens. It's looking a little bit like Presley to me still. I think it's the mouth. There should be a little shadow. There's the line of the lips, but then there's a shadow of the overhang of the upper lip. And then there's this soft shadow at the corner of the mouth. I think also going in with some white. Prosopagnosia, the face blindness. That sounds about right. Oliver Sacks actually had it. He was a famous neurologist. They learned to cope. I mean, you don't know.
Probably find it or founded it.
You don't know what you don't have. I mean, you can't miss what you don't have, right? If you've never had it, you don't know what you don't have.
Right,
So
exactly. Right. Yeah.
I guess it's like color blindness. I mean, how would you know you were colorblind until somebody pointed out like two things that looked different to them but didn't look different to you? Like that would be a pretty weird thing. There's actually a whole island of people genetically colorblind. They're all colorblind. It's just part of their genetics. Oliver
Charles
Sacks
said
wrote about that too. The fusiform. Is it always caused by damage, or is it just sometimes a genetic anomaly? They call the adaptability of the brain as neuroplasticity. I love it that we talk about such interesting things when we're drawing.
It is interesting though how I can recognize everybody's voice. And also I can recognize almost every single motor of every car that goes down my street.
Oh, yeah. You know, my cat can tell when I pull into the driveway. That's the funniest thing. As soon as I pull into the driveway, he jumps in the window and starts screaming at me. Rather disconcerting. I've had people tell me that they could tell by the sound of the car door slamming when their father got home what kind of a mood he was in.
Yeah, there's
whether or
something
not
to it.
he was pissed off or not. That's crazy. You think about it. What we do to our kids.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I know I would really miss around here. Like I can hear the foghorns from here. I can hear, the seagulls and different sounds that make you know that you're, close to the ocean.
Yeah, I do miss the ocean.
Yeah, I would miss that. The sounds of it.
We have cicadas here.
Really?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting because they always come up in the hot summer in August when it gets wet and hot. The cicadas start going crazy. It's really interesting because they have a very ambient. It's almost undescribable how the noise.
Is it kind of like crickets?
Kind of, except it's more like a shh. shushing sound. It's really you can't individuate the crickets. You can tell the individual crickets, but you can't do that with the cicadas. They sing as a mass. Okay, so the white is helping a little bit. You see, it's starting to bring out the forms and the undulations of the skin. I'm sort of wishing I'd gone with the darker paper, but that probably is more about what I'm used to. He's got a very chiseled bridge on his nose. Let's see. So you do want to try, when you're using this tone paper, puppies have to go out, okay. When you're using the tone paper, you want to, well, it's also a stylistic decision, whether or not you want to let how much the paper works for you. You don't have to cover every inch of the paper with pencil. You can let it show through. Let the mid-tone take some of the stress off of the rendering. And so here's a whole other little exciting. See, I'm going to have to bring that in darker, I think, even still, under his eye. And I'll have to get in there with some compressed charcoal to get the black in there. When you're drawing hair, you don't want to try to draw every strand. Okay, that's fine, Lillian. No problem. You want to look for the masses of the tone and the value and the shape. And don't get too wound up with individual hairs, at least not at the beginning. Now later because you really don't see every individual hair. If you think you do, you're probably crazy. We see certain individual hairs on the highlights, but notice it pops out like any texture. The most important part, or the most obvious part of the texture, is going to be in the transitional areas, whereas it disappears in the shadows and it disappears in very strong highlights. So that's part of the observation of it, and not just going with what we think we see in our head, but rather observing and breaking it down almost as an abstraction. So you can see that the highlights come in, where the texture also disappears in the very top part of the highlight. And you do get some individual strands, but they're here and there. actually going to switch and use a little of compressed charcoal because it's so much more powerful than the pencil. See how that just pops right out? It's more intense. So like for his shirt, I might really lay it in for his shirt. I don't want to distract too much from the face though. Alright, bye Melissa. Yeah, I should probably stop. It's like 9:30. I've got all this grading to do, but I'm almost done.
Were you also using a paintbrush? Or I thought I saw you using a paintbrush too.
No, I was using just the compressed charcoal, no paintbrush or smudge stick or anything. It looks like him, but not quite. Likeness is so hard. If you can get it 50%, 75% of the time, you're doing pretty good. Nobody ever nails it 100% of the time. So I don't know how those people that do the ones that are like at Disneyland, you know, on the spot portrait things, those are crazy. I could never do that. I could not do that kind of pressure.
They do a lot of caricatures. They just pick out like a feature.
Yeah, there's a certain science to doing caricatures where you look for the most like defining feature of a person and exaggerate it. It's a whole other art form though.
Lillian wants to know if you got a chance to look at hers.
Oh, do you want me to look at them online here in front of everybody? I will do that if you like. Let me just do a touch more. I'm going to have to make a third pass over this, I think, but
I think it looks just like him. I don't know how you can.
It's pretty close, but there's some not quite. I'm pretty sure his nose is too big. I'm pretty sure.
If there's anything, you just aged him a couple years. That's all.
Yeah, that's possible. He looks a little older than he really is.
But he'll grow into it.
Yeah. As long as his mother recognizes him, that's probably all that matters. Yes, Lillian, do you want me to open it up on the recording, or do you want me to turn off the recording first? I think I'm going to stop while I'm ahead on this guy. I don't want to start smudging, or I'll be doing it on for everything. Oh, your caricature? Okay. I think that I'm going to stop with the recording part and call this near enough. And I may do some little touchies up after I let it sit and ferment for a little while longer. It's good to step away from your work every so often.
That is a paintbrush. Is it a smudge stick? What is that that you're
This?
using right there?
It's a white
Yeah.
charcoal pencil.
Oh, it looks like a paintbrush from over here.
Huh.
Hmm.
No, white charcoal. White charcoal pencil. Okay. I mean, it's not a bad portrait. I'm not saying it's bad, but it needs some work still. Some stuff around the eyes. A little more playing with the values. I want to see if I can't shrink his nose a little bit. Maybe the shadow under his nose to be a little darker.
His nose isn't too big. His nose is right.
I don't know, man. I have to hang it up on the wall and look at it for a while. That's another. Sometimes you just got to let it ferment. You know, you let it. What do you call it? Gestate or digest a little bit before. I don't want to make any hasty decisions. You know, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's coming along pretty good. Okay, so I'm gonna stop this here.